1949.
£6 million worth of Brabazon stands ready at Filton near Bristol, awaiting her trials. As she's towed across the railway from the hangar, you get some impression of her size, for the Brabazon is the largest fabrication plane in the world. For those who like figures, she's 177 feet long, has a wingspan of 230 feet, stands 52 feet high, and is powered by 8 piston engines mounted in pairs and developing in all something over 20,000 horsepower. Her range will be about 5,500 miles. The test is on. For the first time, the Bristol Brabazon Mark I is moving under her own power, and after years of endeavour, the £12 million experiment is underway.
Nobody knew how big it was, you see, this was the point. That nobody quite knew what they were going to do when those doors opened.
There was a murmur from the crowd and the big doors rolled back and out came the Brabazon.
It was frightening, really. It was something like out of H.G. Wells. Those multi-engines whirring around, and it hits you straight away that thing is absolutely gigantic.
Colossal. Was it ever going to, that weight, that size, was it ever going to get off the deck?
And to me, having seen so many types of aircraft built there, the magnificence of it. Nothing, nobody ever seen anything so big. It was a magnificent piece of engineering in itself.
And I think I remember someone saying that the first plane that ever flew, its first hop, was less than the wingspan of Brabazon.
Much less. 120 feet was the Wright brothers' first hop. 230 feet was the Brabazon wingspan, as long as Waterloo Bridge in London, and longer even than the wingspan of the biggest jumbo jet. But to appreciate fully why the Brabazon made such an impact on the imagination, you have to remember that this was just a few years after the Second World War. There was still food rationing. Almost everything was scarce, including money. Britain was always on the edge of one economic crisis or another. Austerity was the key word. When the Brabazon appeared, she was far bigger and more beautiful and more thrilling than anyone had dreamed. She was tremendous. Till then, the biggest plane most people in Britain had seen was a Lancaster bomber. You could park a couple of Lancasters under the Brabazon's wings. She was so huge that passengers would have the kind of freedom they got on a ship, take their meals in a dining room, see a film in a cinema, sleep in real bunks in real cabins. There was a compartment for gold bullion. The captain had his own quarters. The flight crew could get inside the wings and walk about. The Brabazon was to be the first airliner to cross the Atlantic non-stop, as brave an idea for its day as Concorde was decades later. Chief designer for the Brabazon and chief British designer for Concorde was Dr. A.E. Russell, now Sir Archibald Russell. For him, the prehistory of the Brabazon project was as remarkable as anything. It dates back to 1942.
We had a request from the Air Ministry to prepare a design of a bomber carrying the maximum possible load of bombs to Berlin. It had a span of 230 feet. Its weight was 8 times heavier than anything that Bristol had ever built. It was a wild extrapolation. Well, that was left in the drawer somewhere in the ministry.
Then, also in 1942, when the result of the war was very much in doubt, the government set up a committee under Lord Brabazon to decide what sort of civil aircraft Britain would need if and when peace came.
And then one of the members of the Brabazon committee remembered this bomber, and he happened to be the man who was in charge of performance of the Air Ministry too, and he did his own sums, decided that by taking gun turrets out and putting people and other things in besides, that this airplane could indeed fly the Atlantic with some 80 passengers. At the time, even the best American transport, military transport, used to stop 4 times crossing the Atlantic westwards. So non-stop was a bold conception.
An apprentice at BAC, the Bristol Aeroplane Company, working on the Brabazon, was Bob Wall, still at Filton today, and an authority on the history of civil aviation.
The Brabazon Committee produced aeroplanes for a market which really didn't exist. And that's one of the problems. They were looking for the kind of deluxe market which at the time was being carried in the first-class lounges of the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary. People who could afford to do it. They were looking certainly at diplomats, they were obviously looking at the mail. And they conceived an aeroplane which was something in the same way of the old Empire flying boat. A large aeroplane, comfortable aeroplane, and the Brabazon was comfortable. No question of that. You really sank into the luxurious armchairs and just go non-stop to New York with a couple of meals and congenial company. And the food was cooked on board. I mean, every potato served on Imperial Airways up to September the 3rd, 1939 was actually peeled and cooked on board. Now, you know, those days are gone, unfortunately, and they'd gone by 1949, only I don't think anybody realized it.
One aspect that's worth underlining is that BAC had settled the essentials of the Brabazon's design by 1944, and the first drawings were issued well before the end of the war. Specialist teams were already beginning to shape the new airliner, men like Danny Godfrey, electrician, and master woodworker Bert Basco. His job? To build the wooden fuselage jigs, the huge cradle to hold the airliner. That, he was told, would need mahogany. After 5 years of war, he couldn't believe it. Then he got called to the timber stores.
When they took the sheets off, it was all this mahogany. The most beautiful Honduras mahogany you could ever think. And to me, that was like asking for bars of gold, mahogany at that time.
There was an awful lot of pressure on all the time. I can remember one evening I'd had raging toothache, and being a normal human being, tired of dentists, I stuck this for about 3 weeks, and about 7:30 one evening we were in the office thrashing out the problem, and I thought, God, I must do something about this toothache. It was really pounding, and I chased that to a bloke called Williams at the top of Monks Park, and he hauled this tooth out. Now I know I was back in the office again by about 9 o'clock, and I think we were there till like 2 o'clock in the morning now, but the toothache was gone, so it was magic.
Yeah, it was a good time to be an apprentice. And those days, of course, anything to do with aviation had a bit of glamour about it. You know, you went into town at night and all the girls thought it was marvellous, you know, what are you doing? Working on the Brab. I always remember one weekend, the lads on the aeroplane went an outing to London, to the Victoria Palace, when the old Crazy Gang was on. And somebody had obviously tipped the Crazy Gang off, because Bud Flanagan comes onto the stage. No, where's this lot from the Brabazon, you see? And the whole place erupted. We got a standing ovation, simply on the strength of him coming in and saying that, you know. It was surprising how the aeroplane sort of was in the national imagination.
But there was a price to be paid for progress. While the Brabazon project was raising cheers from the crowds at the Victoria Palace, it was causing heartbreak among a handful of villagers at Charlton in Gloucestershire. The trouble was, the Brabazon at 130 tons was so heavy that the existing runway, just under a mile long, was reckoned to be too short. It had to be extended by 1,200 yards, which meant that Charlton and her inhabitants were smack in the way.
It was a real old village. As someone said to me once, you had to go through the village to see it. You couldn't stand on the edge of it. We had a little chapel, a shop and a post office and a public house. And a place which, a hut, which the Americans named the Coconut Grove, where we had whist drives and dances. It was a village life. We had a village life there.
And I think about the first thing I can remember is in our neighbouring farm, they were out in the fields doing some testing. I can picture those men out in that field now with their old, you know, tripods and whatnot.
Well, the first we heard was just like a bit of a rumour. That's what I heard myself. Oh, you got to move out of the Brabazon. Well, I thought nothing of it then, you know, it was large. Anyway, it come to a head, and well, I was absolutely shocked, I tell you. Started talking about it, and we got together in that hut and had one or two open air meetings.
And each meeting we had, they sort of put their side to it, which seemed to be bigger than ours. And it was all for progress, and this plane was being built and it had to fly. And they wanted a runway.
For George Hammond's bulldozer, Charlton was a pushover.
Particularly farms and places like that, it was just one day clear a whole farm, you know, demolished a whole lot. And the few cottages which were around the public house, the Carpenter's Arms, was gone in no time at all. Oh yes, 3 or 4 days, in fact.
And when I got it one morning, it was early in mine, I said I worked on the farm then. You could see the bulldozers going along, taking the edges out. I thought, this is the start of the end of the village. I can see it now as though they just ploughed on, you know. The driver said it was their job and nobody stopped them.
I was the last to come up, the last but one to come up here from the village. And I know on the Monday morning they already had the roof off my house before the furniture was out.
One fireplace was tiled with Shakespearean tiles. We tried to save them, but we didn't. They were smashed up, really.
And I looked back and saw it as we came up, and I thought, oh no. Like a bomb site, and as a bomb had hit it, you know.
1.75 miles away, at the other end of the runway, and out of sight of what remained of Charlton, because the runway has a hump in the middle, the Brabazon was taking shape. So was the Brabazon Assembly Hall, the biggest aircraft hangar in the world, over 1,000 feet long, large enough to hold 3 Brabazons, maybe more. This was to be a giant stride in civil aviation, and everything was being done on a startlingly vast scale. His first sight of the aeroplane certainly opened the eyes of engineering apprentice Wilfrid Harper.
It stood in a hangar, and around it were ordinary aircraft such as, in those days, Beaufighters and Buckmasters. And they were completely dwarfed by the thing. They looked, almost like scale models.
The Brabazon, you could walk up and down in the middle, being 16 feet across, it was almost like a ballroom.
But it was cavernous. You walked in the door, past the bulkhead, and you looked and you thought, my God, you know, this is a cathedral. That was the sort of feeling that one got. It was huge.
It was just like an enormous tunnel. Again, all the engineering was enormous. You know. We were concerned with the engines and drive shafts and the big gearbox. And looking at it, it was more like marine engineering than aircraft engineering at that time. You know, it really was quite enormous. The shafts and the gears were quite enormous.
Don Holbrook. These designs were all new, and they were just a fraction of the whole plane. For the men creating the Brabazon, innovation became the norm. Working to Russ, Dr. Russell, the plane's designer, was Frederick Pollicott, head of the design office.
I think Brabazon was the airplane that took the industry as a whole from simple technology to high technology. It did two things, particularly in this field. It was an entirely different type of airplane we've had before. Things we had begun to learn were coming out, dynamic stressing, dynamic approach to the whole problem. But the Brab, being big and very flexible, brought this to a head. And of course, that's only saying one part of it. I mean, the use of materials. We at Bristol discovered that we were going to have a problem with fatigue, metal fatigue, in the future airplanes. And so it goes on. This is a sample of many, many things that came out of Brab.
The first, of course, was fully power-operated flying controls. The ailerons and the rudder and the elevators, of course, have always been operated by a stick, operated by wires. And here was an airplane where the loads on the flying controls would be far beyond a whole team of chaps pulling on a stick. So it had to be full 100% power. So it was the first airplane in the world to fly that way, and it did so very successfully. So we had new flying controls, new pressurization, new hydraulics, and new electrics, and there isn't much else you can have new.
Nobody knew much about powered flying controls in those days. And I well remember we built a test rig to test out these flying controls. And on one occasion at least, the whole rig ran amok and tore itself out of its concrete mountings, and everybody who was within a few feet of it ran.
The test beds for the engines were, about 25 yards from our drawing office. And you'd have the engines running for 12 hours a day continuously. and you literally could not speak to each other in the drawing office. You had to shout, and you know, I really mean shout. And you put a pencil on top of your desk on the drawing board and it would gradually vibrate down the drawing board. Literally, it was quite shocking. The engines were always off when any inspectors, you know, environment inspectors were around. I'll say no more.
But that didn't matter, you see, because you were actually there on this great big aeroplane, and be involved in the thing, see it grow, was absolutely tremendous. We youngsters, we thought it was marvellous. The interesting thing was that when the hangar was built, really, apart from the aeroplane in one bay and building the second machine, that left a whole bay doing nothing. Heathrow was a building, it hadn't been completed by a long way. So BOAC, as it was then, had really nowhere to put its Atlantic division. And so they brought it to Filton. And in the hangar, alongside the Brabazon, there were about 9 or 10 Constellations being serviced, and of course a lot of Stratocruisers. So you had the competition right alongside. Now, it was fairly obvious to anyone that here with these American-built aeroplanes, you had fast, they were much faster than the Brabazon for a start. They carried almost as many passengers on half the size, and they were profitable. And there really was the competition.
Nobody outside the aviation industry could make that uncomfortable comparison. What the British public saw were stylish artists' impressions of the Brabazon, looking sleek and streamlined. And the official impression given by Filton during those summer months of 1949 was that she was moving smoothly towards her maiden flight. But just as the Swan is all calm majesty above the surface while paddling furiously below, the reality for the Brabazon was very different. Doug Schumark.
Anybody in the aircraft industry will virtually tell you that when you're coming up to the first flight of a prototype aircraft, the last week is absolute panic.
Their first flight took place on a Sunday morning. Well, on Wednesday there was a meeting in London in the ministry to decide whether they could sign off the design certificate from the ministry's point of view to fly. And at that meeting they decided we couldn't. And it had to be altered before they granted. Well, Russ said to me, look, I'm all in, but drive my car back to Bristol, will you, and get some work started. And I came back to Bristol and I didn't go to bed till late Sunday night, from the Wednesday morning.
You were there on Sunday morning?
Oh yes, quivering.
At the very, very late stage, we found that we were in problems with the engines accelerating. And so, of course, that was a hell of an exercise to do that, to make up the little locking jacks, fit them, ensure that they were safe to fly and all the rest of it. Because come what may, it was going to fly on that day.
Bill Pegg, Bristol's chief test pilot, would fly the Brabazon with Walter Gibb sitting beside him as co-pilot. But there were another 8 members of that test crew on board. One was flight test observer Malcolm West.
We did the taxiing trials before the maiden flight on a Saturday. And Bill Pegg was at the controls, of course. And when he was satisfied, we closed down for the day. Walking back to the hangar, the flight crew, with him, he decided, look, we'll taxi up to the west end of the runway, turn round, and if all's well and we've got no faults, off we go. Now, none of the waiting spectators, except possibly, of course, the managing director, knew of this at all.
But of course, I mean, the Evening Post on the Saturday said there was a likelihood of flight, but they'd be taxiing again on the Sunday. All Bristol took them at their word and turned out to see it.
A buzz of excitement went around the city, around everywhere, and people turned up in, I suppose, tens of thousands. And of course, only a few were actually on the airfield. Many were on the golf course nearby and on the A38 and all about. And I remember the day itself because it was fine and summery, September the 4th. And I learned subsequently that it was the warmest September day for 9 years, a very auspicious day.
With a mate of mine, we took the children with us on that morning across the fields, which are now housing complexes, and we clued up behind a wall on top of a barn, an old barn there with the children, looking down on the runway. Well, the press photographers were below us, and they were stood and perched on top of their motor cars.
But they cleared everybody off of the little bridge at the end of the patchway end because they were afraid that the vibration as the plane turned would make the bridge collapse.
Well, the Brabazon was towed out of the hangar and stood on the apron. Lord Brabazon was buzzing about, of course, and an overzealous works policeman immediately ordered him off the apron. He didn't recognize who he was, of course. Well, the Brabazon went to the western end of the runway, and all I could see of it from my position was the tail fin, because there is a hump in the runway. And for some time the engines roared away, and then at last we could see that the fin was moving.
And now this machine, which looks to me like an airship with wings, this long silver cigar with a very big fin, is being readied, and any moment now she'll be turning down this runway to come fast taxiing down, and it may be the takeoff. It may be the takeoff because only Bill Pegg, the pilot, can say when he is going to pull her clear of the ground. And he may suddenly get her nose wheel off and then decide that she feels like flying and pull her the rest of the way, and then away we go, and the Brabazon 1 will be in the air. And that's what everyone is thinking.
Well, perhaps not quite everyone. Many newspapers had confidently predicted that Bill Pegg would let Brabazon lift off briefly and put her down again after a few yards. Co-pilot Walter Gibb knew differently.
It was quite clear. Both of us said, OK, we're going to get airborne this time. And we gave it all full power and started tearing down the runway.
And now she's moving. Now she's moving. Bill Pegg's piled on all the coals. He's piled on all the power onto those 8 engines. And she's roaring away as she moves down the runway. She's gathering speed now, fairly slowly, but she's moving. And the nose wheel is off. The nose wheel is off.
And then Bill lifted the nose wheel off, and the airplane continued coming off, and it really got a bit airborne a bit before we anticipated.
She's off! She's off! She's hopped along the ground. The Brabazon is in the air. If she's in the air, she's driving away. Now that was a straight takeoff. He ran less than half the length of the runway. He's got a bit of flap on, and now this enormous aeroplane is in the air. I yelled at my father, she's off.
Everybody around us just gasped as it left the ground and actually went up into the air.
You could feel the atmosphere of the crowd lift, pushing it up, because it didn't seem to want to rise on its own.
Not quickly, not rising quickly, but ponderously and gracefully and quite majestically. And near me was a group of RAF pilots, and to a man they all threw their hats in the air. I've never seen RAF men do that before, and I suppose I did too. You know, you didn't know what you were doing. It was such an emotional moment to see this immense machine slowly and quietly going away.
The Brabazon's takeoff speed was a mere 85 miles an hour, so the truckload of VIPs and design chiefs who were chasing her down the runway were able to keep her in good view. One of them was Dr. Russell, and as his creation climbed, so did his pulse rate.
I was following along behind the aircraft in a truck along the runway during takeoff. And when it got about 200 feet, you can't describe the sensation when you've been working on an airplane and it takes off the first time. But it took off, and there was a slight interruption in the flight. It bucked a bit. The pilot afterwards said that he'd slipped somewhere and jerked his elbow. And, that was enough to jerk the hearts below.
That is absolutely right. As I say, it raised the nose, and it came up, and it went too high, and it went on when we couldn't get it down. Bill Penny had the control column hard in the dashboard, he had the trimmer wound fully, and I was looking at him, and I said, well, I didn't say anything. I looked at him, and I looked at the thing, and I said, this is no good, and I pulled the power off, and the nose came down, then I put it back on again. And he breathed a sigh of relief. This is why we have 2 pilots in an aeroplane, because he was really sweating. The perspiration was running off his eyebrows, and he was really sweating when that happened.
Downriver she went, and we sat and we talked and we waited and we thought, well, how long are we going to wait? Wouldn't keep her up all that long. Everybody was craning their ears and looking out over towards Avonmouth, knowing that was the way she'd have to come in. And then we heard her. It got louder and louder, and then all of a sudden, over the top of this hill, came this giant silver albatross. Dropping.
Down came the Brabazon, and in the meantime, one of the cameramen panned around and took our spectators. And Bill Pegg stopped her right opposite the cameraman, opened his little flap and waved, and this chappie, who'd been panning the crowd, suddenly found that he'd run out of film. And he really did his nuts.
The Brabazon had flown. No wonder Bill Pegg seemed in high spirits as he leant from the cockpit to give the thumbs-up sign. Lord Brabazon of Tara was one of the first to congratulate the pilot, who had this to say about the historic flight.
We decided that if all the conditions were suitable, we would have a go today. And she was off the ground in some 500 to 600 yards. In fact, she was off so quickly that it took me rather unawares. A very simple business.
It was quite amusing, actually, because there was a marvellous reception marquee for the press, etc., and of distinguished visitors, and the flight crew crept off back to the hangar and got on with work.
But, you know, all the public were doing the cheering. I think I probably wept, I don't know. I think I must have been feeling sort of physically knackered, but I didn't notice it, you know, because the achievement completely overrode the fatigue. Just, you know, we've done it sort of thing.
A great day for British aviation and for Bill Pegg.
Up to a point, no fanfares were coming from the airlines. BOAC made polite applause, but at a time when the going price for a new airliner was £1 million, they weren't about to pay $3 million for a Brabazon. In America, Convair, Douglas and Lockheed had each built prototypes of similar huge multi-piston-engined airliners. No takers. Cruising on its 18-cylinder Centaurus engines at 250 miles an hour, the Brabazon would take 13 hours or more to fly from London to New York. Too long, too slow. As early as 1946, the air correspondent of the Daily Telegraph had said flatly that Brabazon would be underpowered. Russell and his team pressed on regardless.
At the beginning, of course, when you're asked to do a project of this nature, with everyone in the country apparently behind you, you don't question their wisdom, do you? Perhaps you ought to as a purely honest man, but you don't. And I don't remember until the very end of the program anybody asking what the cost of the fare was going to be. As soon as we started to examine the cost of the operation, and we hadn't built any civil airplanes before, we didn't know how to estimate airline costs. It was obvious that the cost of the ticket was going to be fabulous, that it wasn't a proposition. I had doubts fairly soon, but not strong enough to jump over the bridge.
Originally, Brabazon 1 was to fly the Atlantic. Now there was a change of policy. Brabazon 2 would be the airliner. Brab 1 was a flying test bed. In all, she flew nearly 400 hours, and before the end there were signs of trouble. Cracks appeared around the engine mountings, and the hydraulic system played up on occasion too. But they were the exception. Considering her size and her radically new design, Walter Gibb and his fellow test pilots at Filton found her remarkably easy in the air.
It was just a big aeroplane. It was very simple to fly, in actual fact. Bill Pegg made the great remark that you fly the cockpit and the rest comes after you. And there is never a truer remark, actually. The thing that you had to learn with it is it was a big aeroplane, therefore had big inertias. And as long as you kept control of it and let it go its way, it was quite simple to fly. But if it got out of control, or if it started getting away from you, you know, you had to work hard to get it back. It's like flying along a telegraph pole, you know what I mean?
Those 3 years it was flying, from 49 through to 52, round this part of the world. You could always hear it long before it arrived. Now, the Brabazon had a very distinctive sound, a very deep-throated note, but a kind of contented note. It sounded as though it was up there quite happily, busily making hay or something, and going on all day. And it's this very deep, and you could hear it quite perhaps sometimes, 3 or 4 minutes before it actually appeared. And people would say, ah, yes, the Brab's coming. But the Brabazon didn't fly, it proceeded. Very dignified aeroplane. One of its problems, of course, it was too slow.
It was so large, it appeared to be just creeping along so that you couldn't see how it could stay in the air. It was going so slowly. It was like an airship, indeed. In fact, it was airship 1930s thinking. It wasn't a machine for what was coming. It was a machine for what had gone. It was too big, too slow. But of course, it was a very beautiful aircraft. It looked right.
I thought it looked very right. It looked like a whale, wasn't it? I thought it looked beautiful. It was a very clean wing. Like the albatross, you've got to have a big wingspan if you want to fly the Atlantic. That's why an albatross has got a long wingspan, isn't it?
In the end, Brabazon was an albatross in both senses of the word. The plan had been to fit Brab 2 with new, more powerful Bristol Proteus gas turbine engines, but the Proteus was never ready in time. And even before the Brabazon flew, de Havilland's had their Comet jetliner in the air. Nevertheless, the Brabazon story is not one of total failure. After all, to the extent that BAC did just what they were asked to do, it was a design triumph. And what's more, by assembling a hugely talented and experienced team, with those superb facilities of runway and assembly hall, the Brabazon project made possible future design triumphs at Filton. There's an engineering pedigree that runs from Brabazon straight to that whispering giant, the Bristol Britannia, and eventually to Concorde, and it's a pedigree of engineering excellence. That, however, wasn't enough to save the Brabazon. 4 years after her maiden flight, she got the chop.
There's a phrase in the aircraft industry, well, Coley's got it. Now, Coley was a scrap metal company from near London who made a speciality of scrapping airplanes. And I'd always remember the Brabazon 1 being scrapped because Coley's chaps arrived on the Monday morning and by the Friday, my goodness me, they'd made a mess of that airplane. And the whole thing had gone in a fortnight. There was plenty of room in the hangar, so out came the flame cutters. And I always remember they cleared everything away from the port wing. And then 2 chaps got flame cutter and they literally cut that wing off and it dropped down, dunk. There was a hell of a hollow ring on the floor, bong. And it was like, almost having your heart torn out.
And when they announced that it was going to be dismantled, I mean, nobody could believe it. That something so beautiful could possibly be obsolete before it had even begun. Just seemed absolutely ridiculous.
We said then, there's one or two of us said, well, he won't keep up. Well, what happens? So he flew about once or twice, and there was another one in the making. What they do before they finished it, scrapped it all. And I cried for nights on end because I lost my village, and after 40-odd years, I still feel very bitter because even the Concorde now, when he comes in, he doesn't take all the runway where the village was. It's absolutely a white elephant. Waste of money, taxpayers' money.
It behaved as expected. And of course, that wasn't good enough.
The Brabazon was an aeroplane built around the philosophy of the 30s, and then produced in the 40s, and flown in the 50s. And it didn't come together.
The Flying White Jumbo was written and presented by Derek Robinson. The producer was Simon Elms.